Good morning. I'm Morgan Hollick. I'm the youth pastor here at Summit Church, and I'm glad you're joining us on this Tuesday. Our memory verse this week is Psalm 139:14. I praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know very well. I love that verse. I was in a girl small group growing up, and they would always write that on the mirrors and on Post-it notes and stick it in places we would find him, and I just found it super encouraging. I encourage you now to share any glory sightings or prayer requests you might have with us. I have a glory sighting. Mine was over the weekend. I went hiking. We drove up to just past Silverton, and I was hiking with a friend, and we stumbled upon a hot springs. It was kind of this hot spring in the middle of absolute nowhere. Super unexpected, and it was so cool just to sit in that and to look at the view. It was just absolutely amazing. So that was definitely my glory sighting this week, and I'd love to hear what yours was. This week, the sermon was on Enneagram 4s. Pastor Aaron preached on it. We heard from Tammy and Stacy about their take on 4s, the creative, the artists. And I think it's really interesting that we chose to look at Job for 4s. So something interesting about Job is that the book of Job is actually Hebrew poetry. And so it gets a little bit lost in translation. If you read Job in the actual Hebrew, you're able to even see without reading it just by meter and how it parallels that it is poetry, but once it gets translated, we don't have the same words with the same alliterations and all of that. So it gets a little bit lost, which is sad. But today, Aaron encouraged you all to read Job chapters 3 through 31. Definitely a lot of reading. But if you have time, I would definitely dive into it. The book of Job it's interesting, and it also gives voice to the deepest level of human grief. And so I actually took a class in seminary on Hebrew poetry, and we took a long look at the book of Job. And I realized as that class went on how many of the people in that class took it because they had something really, really traumatizing, really grief-filled happen to them, and they found that Job gave them voice and gave them permission to express those deep feelings of sadness and anger and depression, all of the things. And as that class went on and I heard their stories, I realized Job is so, so important to our canon. It's such an important book to pay attention to. So today's devotion is going to be a little more academic style, and that's because I did take this Hebrew poetry class, and I actually wrote an entire paper on just the chapter of Job 3, because I think Job 3 has, in particular, a really beautiful poetry. And so I'm going to read you this paper because I am proud of it, and I think it has a lot of important highlights for those of us who can't read Hebrew. So just sit back and listen. Job 3 is a poem full of woe and anguish. Job uses multiple poetic devices such as structures of intensification, which we'll talk more about, sound and wordplay, and imagery to give voice to his deepest sorrows. Without recognizing Job 3 as a poem, there could be many valuable things that we overlook. From the start, Job 3 uses structural intensification in a way that draws those who hear Job's cry deeper and deeper into his despair with him with every line. He curses the day of his birth, and then intensifies this curse in a parallel form by cursing the night of his conception. This text vividly illustrates why the Hebrew prophets so often chose to cast their urgent message in verse. Because this poetic vehicle of parallelistic verse offered a particularly effective way of imaginatively realizing inevitability, of making powerfully manifest to the listener the idea that consequences he might choose not to contemplate could happen. He cries out, "Let the day perish in which I was born. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, or light shine on it. Let gloom and darkness claim it. Let clouds settle upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it." That's verses 3a, 4 through 5. This curse does not satisfy the anguish of Job, however. The dread he feels causes him to not only despise the day he was born, but even the day he was conceived. So he intensifies the curse upon his life by extending its reach even further, and by reversing the language of Genesis in regards to creation, Job also curses God. So Job actually references the origin of the world, and he mentions very specific things about that, Job, as he's making curses. And he's doing that to say, even the very beginnings of all of creation, curse it. Through this structure of intensification, Job's complaints take full emotional measure to intimately reach all the way to God. He asserts, "Curse the night that said, a man-child is conceived. That night let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Yes, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry be heard in it, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb and hide trouble from her eyes." Job's insistence on darkness is a direct reversal of God's creative command in Genesis 1, 3 through 5, "Let there be light." From Job's perspective, though, light has no place in his life. After each creative act, God saw what was created. Job says, "May God above not seek it." This day is such a sort of evil that it can be redeemed only if gloom and deep darkness obscure it from view and from memory. This morning stands in contrast to the day which attends days of birth and days of creation in general. Through this contrast, Job extends and intensifies his anguish and curse from the day he was conceived all the way back to the origins of the world and unto God's creative action. Job additionally reaches across eons in verse 8 to the world's very beginnings to rouse up Leviathan. I probably missaid that. It's like a Greek god. So that even a mythological cosmic figure can curse the day he was born. The inclusion of days, months, and years in verse 6, "Let it not rejoice among the days of the year, let it not come into the number of the months," is used to further intensify Job's curse and mourning as he draws out the idea that he wished his life was never brought into the cycle of linear time. An additional structuring and intensifying factor is the overall outline of Job 3. Verse 3 and verse 11 operate as framing devices beginning with the subject of the curse, followed by the reasoning behind the lament. I actually wrote out a structure of what this looks like in this paper, so it's easy to see with your eyes. So I can't exactly read that to you. It wouldn't read well because it's actually like a visual of how these things are sandwiched together and all of that. So we're just going to skip over that part. Job 3 parallels day and night, incantation summoning darkness and oblivion, the grounds for his curse and lament, the whys following various portrayals, rest, repose, and turmoil. It is within this very intentional frame that Job is able to specifically direct his lament and reasoning. Soundplay and wordplay are additional poetical devices used in Job 3. Unfortunately, the strength of this poem rooted in these types of plays are lost in translation. Like we mentioned before, when we translate from Hebrew to English, there's just not the same beat to it anymore, so we lose a lot of that. Because the author of Job is one of those very rare poets like Shakespeare who combine awesome expressive power with dazzling stylistic virtue. When did I stop writing and speaking like this? Wow, this is really fancy. Virtuosity. The translation dilutes the original even more than for other biblical poems. Oh, that's because I was quoting something else. That makes sense. The Hebrew language is able to do things that we cannot possibly reduplicate while maintaining the integrity of the actual meaning of the words while translating. For example, Anana in line 3 and Renanha in line 5 are a rhymed antithesis. Wow, this is bad. Yet their English counterparts are Paul and sound of joy, which clearly do not rhyme. Verse 8 also contains wordplay. In it, Job asserts, "Let it be damned by those who curse the day, by those ready to rouse Leviathan." The Hebrew word for day is yom, and the Hebrew word for sea is yam. In Isaiah 51, 9 through 10, yam is parallel with Tannain and dragon, which in turn is parallel with Leviathan. In Psalm 74, 14, yam and Leviathan can therefore be considered a standard word pair, making the parallelism inferred. Luckily, Job 3 is still recognizable as a poem without the Hebraic sound and word plays due to other strong poetic devices, but it's still important to note the presence of these devices as they were written with intentionality and would invite those who read or heard this poem in Hebrew into the text in a more gripping way. All that being said, basically, there are words used that actually rhyme, so kind of think like Dr. Seuss, one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. He uses the same thing in Job 3, but we aren't able to read that because the translated words don't rhyme in the same way. Imagery is another poetic device that Job employs. Darkness and light are mentioned many times throughout Job 3. Verse 9 states, "Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light but have none," which portrays a morning that will never quite come because the stars that are meant to shine bright are broken. Beyond the brokenness, there is a longing for the sunrise, but it will never come because of the broken stars. This portrays not only a black void where a glowing horizon should be, but it's a void of despair, longing, and agony. It isn't enough for there to simply be a void of all goodness and light, because then there wouldn't necessarily be the presence of severe agony, which Job is experiencing. The darkness and light imagery used in verse 9 brings a picture to life that portrays this agony. Furthermore, Job anguishes over being born in the first place, and in his anger complains that he wasn't delivered as stillborn. It's like very graphic, which creates vivid imagery, especially in contrast with the imagery of the grave that he wishes to immediately be buried in. Job presents the idea here that death is an escape from suffering. In verses 17 through 19, he recognizes all the people who got to escape a sort of suffering through death. His lines support the common saying, "Death does not discriminate." And while most people tend to engage that saying with sadness, Job would see relief and joy in it. This poem as a whole is one filled with anguish and lament. Through structural intensification, sound and wordplay and imagery, Job brings his untethered grief before the Lord. It is important to recognize Job 3 as a poem to be able to appreciate the depth and the intentionality of Job's words. Recognizing Job 3 as a poem allows the pastor to see beyond Job's surface level lament and into the depths of despair which seek death as relief. This offers insight into the lives and dispositions of those who are in the deepest depths of grieving that many people cannot venture into and often cannot relate to or understand. It also offers a voice to those who are in the midst of anguish. In a culture that often does not encourage or appreciate extreme expressions of anger or sadness, people inherently learn to keep these emotions inside instead of bringing them before the Lord, who desires to be with us in our despair. Job 3 provides an opportunity for all to explore how deep anguish can take us, which is so important to recognize in order to fully appreciate the fact that God's reach is not deeper still. So I think there's not a whole lot left unsaid by that, but I think it's also really interesting that Job is poetry, because fours are the ones who are really value art and would be the sorts that are super into poetry. I'm a 5, but I'm still into poetry, but nonetheless, I encourage you, if you're into that sort of thing and you want to learn more about that, to just get a book on it. Lots of people have written about Old Testament poetry, specifically poetry found in Job. Oh gosh, it's so interesting to read about the poetry in Psalms as well. But something Aaron mentioned in his sermon is that fours kind of struggle with this who am I? What is my life about? And kind of this gloomy darkness that can come from not feeling firmly planted. Have an identity that's tethered to God. And he mentioned gratefulness being like a very grounding practice and something that's good to do. And so in a minute, we're going to pray, but I invite you to close your eyes with me. And I am just my prayer is going to be me listing off things that I'm grateful for. I'm going to take those things before God as just a thank you, as just a practice of gratefulness. And I invite you to do the same. I'll invite you to close your eyes. And even as I'm going, you can either listen, or if you want to list off your own, just sit there. We're not in a hurry. Just as they come to you, say it aloud. Bring your joys and thanksgiving before the Lord. So I'll invite you now to pray with me. Lord, for air conditioning, fresh air, coffee, friendships, dogs, pillows, blueberry muffins, freedom, poetry, your word, love, for Netflix, for prosciutto, for mercy, for plants, for family, for jobs, opportunities for forgiveness, cars, washing and dryer machines, for clothes, for health, for mercy. For all these things and more, we are so grateful, Lord. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to live lives that are blessed, even beyond our moments of despair. Help root us in our identity that is found in you. You call us holy and beloved, child of God. You call us righteous and redeemed. Help us remember this even on our deepest days when we're in the depths of darkness. Help us remember that there is a light that reaches deeper still. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you so much for joining me today. And